For thousands of years, humanity looked up at the sky with a mixture of wonder and fear. The heavens were a realm untouched, a place reserved for gods, spirits, and the untamed forces of nature. Clouds drifted like ancient guardians, storms growled like unseen beasts, and lightning sliced across the horizon with the authority of a divine warning. To early civilizations, the sky was not simply air and wind, it was a border. A border that separated the fragile world of mankind from a greater, more mysterious domain. Yet with every passing century, humanity pushed against that boundary. We learned to measure the winds, to predict storms, to draw maps of the stars. And eventually, we dared to build machines that could carry us upward. Machines that challenged the very order of nature itself. By the dawn of the 20th century, the sky had become a symbol. A symbol of progress, of courage, and of the unstoppable human desire to reach beyond the possible. Airplanes, once fragile skeletons of wood and cloth, evolved into powerful constructs of steel and fire. Airborne creatures born from factories, fueled by ambition, and guided by young men who had learned to trust their instinct more than gravity. But with progress came shadows. As nations armed themselves with new technologies, the sky, once a sanctuary of dreams, slowly transformed into a strategic frontier. It became territory that could be controlled, contested, weaponized. A place where altitude meant advantage, and where every kilometer gained above the ground shifted the balance of power below it. By 1939, the world trembled again. The clouds no longer floated silently above peaceful cities. They now carried the echo of engines, the rumble of bombers, the promise of destruction from heights humanity had only recently learned to reach. The sky became a chessboard on which the fate of nations would soon be decided. Those who could dominate the air would dominate the earth. And then came the moment where history bent. Europe fell into darkness. Armies marched, borders collapsed, and a new kind of war began. A war fought not only on land and sea, but in the vast, shifting plains of the atmosphere. The heavens, once the realm of gods, were now the battleground of mortals. Young pilots, barely out of school, rose into the clouds like modern warriors of myth, guiding their machines through storms of metal and fire. In their hands, the sky ceased to be a dream, it became a weapon, a shield. And ultimately, the deciding arena of the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. This is the story of that arena. The story of how the sky, eternal, silent, immeasurable, became the place where steel met cloud, where courage challenged destiny, and where the fate of humanity hung suspended in the thin, trembling air. This is the battle for the skies. The battle where the world's future was written not on land, but far above it, in the shifting winds of a storm mankind had created. When the first air raid sirens echoed across Europe, the sky became more than a quiet blue ceiling above humanity, it turned into a vast arena where ideologies, ambitions, and the fate of nations would collide. Yet before steel screamed through the clouds, before contrails carved scars across the heavens, something quieter unfolded, the birth of the squadrons that would soon become legends. They were not formed from heroes. They were formed from young men who had seen airplanes mostly in newspapers, who felt more excitement than confidence, more fear than skill. And yet the world demanded from them nothing less than mastery of a new battlefield, a battlefield without trenches, without walls, without mercy. Training airfields buzzed with a restless energy. Wooden barracks, muddy runways, the scent of gasoline heavy in the air, these places became the cradle of the Sky Wardens, the generation destined to guard the world from above. Instructors, veterans of older wars, looked at the new recruits with a difficult mixture of pride and sorrow. They knew that many of these young faces would fade long before the war ended, swallowed by clouds and fire. But every day the drills continued. Takeoff. Landing. Sharp turns. Emergency dives. Hours and hours of relentless repetition until muscle and instinct merged into one. What had once seemed like a thrilling dream slowly became a merciless discipline, a discipline on which their futures depended. Squadrons formed in every corner of the world. Some trained on grass airstrips, others in deserts, on cliffs, or on cold northern plains. Yet despite different languages, different flags, and different aircraft, all of them shared one truth: soon the sky would become the most decisive front of the war. And every pilot would need to become an extension of his machine. The bond between pilot and aircraft grew into something almost spiritual. At dusk, the silhouettes of fighters stood like steel beasts waiting to be awakened. Mechanics swarmed over them with devotion, patching metal, tuning engines, tightening bolts. Pilots touched the cold skins of their machines as if trying to understand them, memorize them, trust them. They knew that inside these thin shells of aluminum lay their only protection, and sometimes, their only weapon. And then the day arrived. Orders came. Engines roared. The first squadrons thundered into the sky. The tremble of the earth beneath the runways marked the beginning of a new chapter, the moment when these once uncertain recruits crossed the invisible line between practice and war. The sky was no longer a place of dreams. It had become the frontier where the fate of the world would soon be decided. By the time the first shots of the air war echoed across continents, the sky was already filled with beings unlike anything humanity had ever created. Not animals. Not weapons. Something in between. Aircraft of the early war were more than machines, they were embodiments of national character, forged from ambition, fear, and engineering genius. Each nation released its own steel predator into the clouds, hoping that its wings would carry the future. Some planes were born as hunters. Sleek, sharp-nosed, lightweight fighters designed to climb fast and strike even faster. Others were built as armored guardians, slower, heavier, but able to take punishment no human could survive alone. And then there were bombers, colossal metal beasts that carried destruction across oceans, shaking worlds with the thunder of their engines. Every machine had a personality. The British Spitfire, with its elegant elliptical wings, almost danced through the air, as if defying gravity itself. German Messerschmitts sliced through the sky with ruthless precision, born from an industry obsessed with efficiency and dominance. The Soviet Yak and Lavochkin fighters embodied survival, rugged, simple, built to endure winter, mud, and fire. The American P-40, heavy and muscular, felt like a boxer that refused to quit even when outmatched. But no matter the shape or sound, every aircraft shared one thing: a soul. Not the kind found in living beings, but the soul that humans unknowingly breathe into their creations when they build them for something greater than themselves. Pilots often spoke to their planes before takeoff, quietly, almost ritualistically. As if asking for protection. As if forming a pact. Inside the cockpit, the world shrank to metal, glass, and heartbeat. Instruments flickered. The engine growled like a living creature awakening from sleep. Vibrations ran through the frame, into the pilot's gloves, into his bones. And once the wheels lifted from the earth, the aircraft became a part of him, an extension of will and instinct. Engineers worked tirelessly to upgrade these machines. Faster engines. Stronger frames. More firepower. Every improvement was a race against time, because the enemy was evolving too. What was superior today became obsolete tomorrow. And above this technological duel hovered a single, unspoken truth. The war would not be won by numbers alone. It would be won by the machine that could reach higher, strike harder, survive longer, and carry its pilot home. As clouds drifted over continents and shadows of wings passed silently across villages, factories, and fields, humanity realized something profound. The sky itself had become a laboratory of innovation, a crucible where future technology was being born through fire and sacrifice. And high above the earth, these steel creatures battled not only each other, but the limits of what humans could create. The first true clash in the skies did not begin with a heroic charge or a dramatic declaration. It began with silence, a silence so tense that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Pilots sat strapped into their cockpits, the rising sun reflecting off their canopies, unaware that within minutes they would enter a world no human had ever truly experienced, the chaos of air combat. Radar screens flickered. Ground crews looked up, squinting at distant shadows approaching across the horizon. Commanders barked orders into radios, their voices trembling with the realization that history was about to change forever. And then it came, the unmistakable roar of engines. The enemy had arrived. Squadrons scrambled into the air like arrows shot from a bow. Dust swirled across the runways as dozens of fighters clawed upward, engines screaming as if trying to escape gravity's grip. The sky that moments ago felt infinite now felt suffocatingly small. There was no time to think. No time to fear. Only instinct. At first, the enemy planes appeared as dark specks against the rising light. Then those specks became shapes. Wings. Propellers. The glare of sunlight flicking off metal. And then, the moment that every pilot dreads and trains for, the distance vanished. The first pass. Two formations rushed past each other with terrifying speed. No gunfire. No hits. Only the deafening shock of two storms colliding. Then, as if a signal had been given, the sky erupted. Tracers slashed through the air like flaming needles. Engines thundered. Pilots pulled their sticks with all their strength, bodies crushed against their seats by the brutal force of G-loads. Fighters spiraled downward, smoke trailing behind like a wounded comet. Another exploded in a flash that was gone as quickly as it came. What had moments earlier been a majestic sky was now a swirling vortex of metal, fire, and desperation. Yet amid the chaos, something remarkable emerged. A strange clarity. Pilots described it later as a second heartbeat, a state where time slowed, senses sharpened, and the world reduced to the cockpit, the target, and survival. Dogfights twisted through the clouds like dueling dragons. Every maneuver was a gamble. Dive too fast, the wings could tear away. Climb too slow, and you became an easy target. The line between life and death was drawn thinner than the wings they flew on. Below, soldiers and civilians looked up, watching tiny silver shapes wheel and spiral against the morning sky. They couldn't hear the screams of engines or the rattle of machine guns. They saw only distant glimmers of sunlight and smoke, unaware that above them, men were rewriting the rules of warfare. And when the battle finally ended, when the surviving planes limped back to their airfields with bullet holes stitched across their wings, one truth became clear. Humanity had unleashed a new kind of combat, fast, merciless, and fought in a world where gravity itself became an enemy. From that day forward, the sky was no longer a place of peace. It was a battlefield. The early victories of air forces across the world created a dangerous illusion, the illusion that the sky could be controlled, perhaps even dominated, like land or sea. But the sky has no borders. No trenches. No walls. And soon, the pilots learned that this battlefield was not merely hostile. It was alive. Weather became the first great adversary. Storms rose like mountains made of wind, swallowing squadrons whole. A clear horizon could transform, in minutes, into a writhing mass of thunderclouds that cracked open with blinding strikes of lightning. Pilots who had trained for combat were suddenly fighting against forces that no bullet could pierce. Visibility vanished. Instruments trembled. Wings strained under brutal turbulence. Many planes disappeared into the storm and were never seen again. Then came the cold. High-altitude missions pushed aircraft into temperatures so severe that metal groaned like a living creature, oxygen masks froze solid, and engine oil thickened into sludge. Frost crept across canopies in delicate white patterns, beautiful and deadly. Pilots felt their fingers stiffen, their breath turn to ice crystals inside their masks. The cold did not care about bravery. It consumed without hesitation. But nature was not the only foe turning against them. Mechanical failure was a silent predator that stalked every mission. Engines overheated. Fuel lines cracked. Radios went dead. A single loose bolt could transform a plane from a weapon into a coffin. Sometimes pilots heard a strange rattle or felt an unfamiliar vibration, warnings that the end might be seconds away. And yet, mission after mission, they took off again, trusting machines that were pushed far beyond what engineers had ever intended. And then there was the human body, fragile, unprepared, breaking under forces it was not designed to endure. Sharp turns and sudden climbs crushed pilots into their seats with invisible weight. Vision dimmed into gray tunnels. Heartbeats stuttered. Blackouts came without mercy, and many pilots awoke only to find themselves falling from the sky, their planes spiraling toward the earth like wounded birds. All of this happened even before the enemy fired a single shot. In the official reports, these losses were labeled as accidents, weather-related incidents, or mechanical failures. But among pilots, they carried a different meaning, a painful understanding that the sky was not just a battlefield. It was a judge. A judge that tested every weakness, punished every mistake, and demanded the ultimate respect. Yet despite the storms, the cold, the failures, and the crushing forces, pilots returned to the air again and again. They learned to read the clouds like soldiers reading terrain. They memorized the moods of their engines, listened to the rhythm of the wind. They adapted. They survived. And through this brutal education, they earned something that no training ground could ever give them. Mastery of a world that was never meant for human beings. By the middle of the war, a new kind of warrior had emerged, one unlike any soldier who had ever fought on land or sea. These were the duelists of the sky, pilots who had survived storms, mechanical failures, and the crushing brutality of early battles. Their faces were sharper, their reflexes faster, their instincts honed to a razor's edge. They no longer flew like students or recruits. They flew like predators. Aces began to appear, men whose skill seemed almost unnatural, whose names spread across continents like legends. Some nations celebrated them as heroes, others feared them as omens. But one truth united them all: they had mastered the art of aerial combat in a world that offered no second chances. Dogfights were no longer chaotic swirls of fear and improvisation. They became duels, calculated, deliberate, fought with a precision that bordered on artistry. Pilots learned to read each other's movements the way chess masters read the board. A slight tilt of the enemy's wing could reveal intent. A sudden climb meant a trap. A dive at the wrong moment meant death. Every duel began with silence, that moment when two pilots locked onto each other across the sky, each knowing that only one would return. Engines roared. Wings shuddered. And then the dance began. The tactics were many. The scissors, where two planes weaved back and forth, each trying to slip behind the other. The boom and zoom, where a faster fighter swooped down like a hawk before climbing away to safety. The deadly spiral dive, where only the most skilled pilots could pull out before hitting the ground. But the greatest weapon was not speed, nor firepower, nor maneuverability. It was patience. Aces waited for the perfect moment, the moment when the enemy exposed a weakness so small it could only be sensed, not seen. Then a burst of gunfire. A flash of sparks. A trail of smoke. And another plane began its long fall toward the earth. Yet even as these pilots became symbols of mastery, they were painfully human beneath their helmets. They dreamed. They feared. They mourned. They carried the weight of every friend who did not return, the empty chairs in briefing rooms, the abandoned uniforms, the quiet hangars where a plane sat waiting for a pilot who would never touch its controls again. Some aces survived hundreds of missions. Others died on their first victory. In the sky, talent was never a guarantee. And pride was always punished. Still, the duelists kept flying. Not for glory. Not for medals. But because they understood something profound: the war in the sky was not just fought with machines, but with the human spirit, fragile, determined, relentless. They were warriors of a new era, drawing invisible lines of fire across the heavens. And with every duel, they changed the future of aerial combat forever. As the war deepened, darkness no longer brought silence. What once hid the world in peaceful shadows now became a cloak for destruction. The night sky, once a place of stars and quiet winds, transformed into a battleground lit only by the flashes of tracer fire and the distant glow of burning cities. Night missions were a different kind of war, slower, quieter, far more terrifying. Daylight gave pilots a sense of control, a feeling that they could at least see the enemy approaching. But at night, sight itself became unreliable. Shapes blurred. Horizons vanished. Even the stars seemed to disappear behind the black smoke that stained the heavens. Bombers rose into the darkness like floating fortresses, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Their crews operated by dim red lights that barely illuminated their faces, giving them a ghostly appearance. Every sound mattered, the rattle of loose metal, the sudden drop of altitude, the whine of a strained engine. These were the signs that could mean life or death. Below them, entire cities lay in darkness, their lights extinguished to avoid detection. But even without illumination, the glow of war could not be hidden. Fires burned on the horizon. Searchlights stabbed the sky like enormous white spears. Anti-aircraft guns filled the darkness with explosive flowers of orange and white. And then came the hunters. Night fighters, fast, agile predators equipped with radar systems that were crude but deadly, rose from airfields to intercept the bombers. Their pilots flew by instinct, guided only by faint blips on screens and the voice of a radar operator whispering directions through the headset. Every interception was a duel in the dark, where neither side could see the other until it was already too late. A bomber crew might hear only a sudden burst of gunfire tearing through the fuselage, followed by alarms screaming through the cabin. The night swallowed the smoke and flames so quickly that pilots often didn't realize they were falling until the ground rushed up at them out of nowhere. For night fighter pilots, the experience was equally haunting. They slipped through pitch-black skies, fingers tense on the trigger, hunting shadows that carried hundreds of lives and thousands of pounds of explosives. Victory was often invisible, just a flicker of fire far below, then nothing. Yet amid all this darkness, something quietly changed. Technology advanced. Radios improved. Radar grew sharper. Crews learned to trust their instruments as much as their instincts. A new kind of skill emerged, the ability to fight without light, without clear vision, guided only by sound, machinery, and intuition. The night became a battlefield ruled not by superiority, but by discipline, nerves, and the ability to embrace uncertainty. And as bombs fell and engines roared through the blackness, humanity realized that darkness itself had become a weapon, one that no side truly controlled, but both were forced to use. The winter of the war's third year revealed a sky transformed. What had once been a battlefield of desperate gambles was becoming a realm of strategy, precision, and relentless pressure. In Part 8, the air war reached a critical turning point, a moment when control of the skies no longer shifted like sand, but finally began to settle in one direction. It started with numbers, not only planes in the air, but fuel, factories, trained pilots, navigators, mechanics, and radar operators. One side found itself capable of replacing every lost aircraft with two more, while the other struggled to fill empty hangars. The imbalance didn't happen overnight, it grew like a storm cloud, layer by layer, until it finally burst. But superiority wasn't just measured by quantity. New tactics reshaped the air. Fighter escorts flew farther than ever before, clinging to bombers as iron shields. Missions once suicidal slowly became survivable. Long-range fighters darted ahead, clearing corridors through the sky like steel-winged wolves. Radar stations learned to read the invisible language of the atmosphere, identifying enemy formations long before engines could be heard. What was once chaos became a system, a machine of air, timing, and coordination. For the first time, entire missions could be planned knowing the sky might actually be held. Pilots noticed the difference. Where they once flew trembling through swarms of interceptors, they now saw enemy fighters launching fewer, more desperate attacks. Anti-aircraft batteries barked from the ground, but even those were showing signs of strain, less ammunition, fewer trained crews, slower response times. Meanwhile, the factories producing planes for the struggling side were being struck harder and deeper. Assembly lines halted. Fuel reserves burned. Hangars were left roofless, and runways cratered. Pilots arriving for briefing sometimes found that the aircraft scheduled for their mission no longer existed. Those who still took off stepped into the air with a weight they couldn't ignore, not just the danger, but the sense that momentum had begun to slip permanently from their grasp. Above it all, the growing dominance of one air force created an entirely new kind of pressure on the ground. Armies marching or retreating now moved under constant watch. Supply convoys hid in forests. Rail lines operated only at night, and even then at risk. Commanders realized that battles were being shaped long before tanks clashed or infantry advanced, shaped by what the enemy saw or failed to see from above. And yet, despite this turning tide, no one in the air believed the struggle was close to ending. Experienced aces still rose to challenge the sky, flying with unmatched skill and grim determination. Anti-aircraft guns remained deadly. Weather continued to sabotage even the strongest air fleets. And every mission, no matter how well planned, still required pilots to stare into the same darkness and fire they'd always known. But the balance had shifted. Quietly. Irreversibly. The skies were no longer contested, they were being claimed. This was the moment when momentum broke, when steel, fuel, training, and time converged into a force that would shape the outcome of the entire war. And from this point forward, every battle on the ground would feel the weight of what happened far above the clouds. By the time the spring sun rose over the scarred cities of the war's fourth year, the sky was no longer just a battlefield, it had become a forge. Every mission, every sortie, every hour spent above the clouds hammered its consequences onto the earth below. And in Part 9, that forge unleashed its most terrifying creation, the birth of firestorms, the moment when air power reshaped entire landscapes. It began with patterns, the slow, calculated dismantling of infrastructure. Rail yards were struck until steel lay twisted like roots ripped from the ground. Oil depots erupted into black pillars of smoke that blotted out the horizon. Entire factory districts vanished beneath rolling waves of flame. And as each target burned, the pressure on the enemy's war machine grew heavier, more impossible to ignore. Supplies dwindled. Repairs slowed. Vehicles rolled out of factories half-finished or not at all. Yet what defined this part of the air war was not the destruction of machines, but the destruction of cities themselves. Dense districts, built long before aviation existed, reacted violently when struck from above. Flames fed on narrow streets and wooden structures. Heat rose until it birthed winds that howled like living creatures. Entire neighborhoods became vortexes of fire, drawing oxygen, debris, even people toward their blazing centers. Pilots flying miles above could see the inferno twisting into the shape of a burning storm, a phenomenon no one had imagined before the war. For civilians on the ground, it was a nightmare with no direction. The walls shook as if giants walked the streets. Glass melted. Pavements cracked in the heat. Mothers carried children through smoke so thick it felt like a physical barrier. Fire brigades fought until their hoses ran dry, until the heat warped their ladders, until the air itself seemed to burn. Survivors stumbled from the ruins covered in ash, barely recognizing the streets they had lived on for decades. Meanwhile, the air crews who caused this destruction carried their own burden. The cockpit's glass reflected the inferno beneath them, a silent reminder of the scale of their mission. Some looked away. Others stared straight into the blaze, trying to convince themselves it was necessary. A few never spoke of it again. War in the skies had always been violent, but now it had crossed into something elemental, something that carved itself into memory. Strategically, the firestorms delivered what high command wanted: factories erased, morale shaken, production crippled. But something else happened too: the enemy began to disperse industry into forests, caves, and mountains. Entire plants were moved underground. Workers toiled in dim, cramped tunnels where machines echoed like thunder. The sky could burn cities, but breaking an enemy's will required far more than flames. Meanwhile, anti-air defenses adapted, shifting farther away from major targets, hiding in fields, or blending into wreckage. Fighter squadrons lifted into the air with renewed fury, driven not by confidence, but by desperation, the understanding that every bomber they failed to stop meant another city might vanish. And yet the bombers kept coming. Their shadows passed over landscapes marked by scorched outlines where neighborhoods once stood. Roads glowed faintly in the night from still smoldering fires. Entire regions lived under the constant expectation of the next siren, the next wave, the next night when the sky itself would ignite. This was the period when air power reached its most devastating form, not as precision, not as strategy, but as raw elemental force. A force that consumed, reshaped, and scarred everything it touched. The war was approaching its climax, and the firestorm below was only a prelude to the final struggle that waited beyond the clouds. By the final year of the war, the sky, once wild, contested, unpredictable, had become something else entirely, a stage on which the last act of the global conflict was unfolding. Part 10 is the culmination of all that came before it, the victory shaped not just by armies, but by the dominance of air, by the pilots who endured, and by the machines that carried the fate of nations in their wings. The change was immediate, unmistakable. Where enemy fighters once swarmed the horizon like a living storm, now only a handful struggled into the air. The hum of engines that once sent shivers through bomber crews had thinned to a distant buzz. Radar screens that years earlier had glowed with hostile signatures now showed empty space, calm like a sea after a hurricane. On the ground, armies advanced with a confidence they had never known. Columns of tanks moved in daylight, no longer hiding under trees or smoke. Supply convoys stretched for miles, unafraid of sudden air raids. The thunder of artillery coordinated seamlessly with the roar of engines above. The sky had become a shield, a protective dome held in place by thousands of sorties every week. But superiority did not mean the war was over. The final targets were the most heavily defended, the most crucial, the most symbolic. Factories buried beneath mountains. Command bunkers carved deep into earth and rock. Last-stand airfields scattered across forests. Every mission mattered, not because each strike alone would end the war, but because together they tightened the final ring. Pilots felt the shift too. Briefings grew shorter, clearer, more confident. Intelligence became sharper. New aircraft entered service with capabilities earlier generations would have considered impossible: faster climbs, longer range, more precise instruments. Even the weather seemed to offer fewer surprises, as meteorologists refined their forecasts with experience earned through years of hardship. Yet in these final months, the war in the sky carried a new weight, not fear, but reflection. Crews walked past rows of fresh replacements, remembering the faces who had once filled those seats. Some squadrons had lost more men than they had left. Veterans approached their aircraft with a quiet ritual, a touch on the fuselage, a whispered word, a moment of stillness before climbing aboard. And still, the enemy defended fiercely. Anti-aircraft guns concentrated into deadly pockets around the last industrial sites. Fighter aces, some with hundreds of missions behind them, took to the air again and again, knowing the odds were hopeless but refusing to surrender. Each interception was a clash between experience and inevitability. Each dogfight became a final chapter in a personal story of survival. Then came the missions that marked the true ending, strikes against the last production lines. Raids that shattered the remaining fuel reserves. Attacks that left enemy runways cratered beyond use. One by one, the pillars holding the war effort collapsed, not with a sudden crash, but with accumulating fractures. And finally, there were no enemy fighters left to rise. The skies became quiet in a way they had not been since the first days of the conflict. Pilots flying reconnaissance missions reported the same sight again and again: empty airfields, abandoned equipment, cities silent beneath thin veils of smoke. Victory was not declared in the clouds, but it was decided there. When the ceasefire finally came, many airmen were still in their cockpits, circling above landscapes that had shaped their lives. Some felt relief so deep it left them breathless. Others felt only exhaustion. A few looked out at the horizon, wondering how the world would rebuild after the sky had burned for so long. The war had been fought on land, sea, and in the hearts of millions, but the skies had been where its fate was sealed. And as peace slowly spread across nations, the pilots who survived carried with them the memory of a world suspended between steel and clouds. The last horizon had been crossed. The sky was finally quiet.